I'm Daniel Levine, and this is the Bio Report. There's been growing interest in the potential of psychedelics to treat a variety of mental health conditions. While some focus has been put on synthesizing compounds that can target the receptors psychedelics bind to without inducing their hallucinatory effects, Filament Health is taking a notably different approach. The company, co-founded by Ben Lightburn, who previously ran a firm specializing in natural extraction technologies, is focusing on developing pharmaceutical-grade botanical drugs that may benefit from multiple active compounds rather than an isolated active ingredient. We spoke to Lightburn, founder and CEO of Filament Health, about the company's approach to psychedelic medicine, the case for natural botanical extracts rather than synthetic compounds, and its lead experimental therapy that targets methamphetamine use disorder. Ben, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure to be on. Thanks for having me.
We're going to talk about psychedelic medicine, Filament Health, and the company's pursuit of botanicals rather than chemically synthesized versions of psychedelics. Prior to founding Filament, you were CEO of Maza Innovation, a natural extraction startup which you sold in 2018. How did Maza Innovation set the stage for the founding of Filament Health?
Well, that's a great question. The answer kind of actually goes back before working at Maza. I've really been actually working my entire career in the field of natural extracts. And that is to say, researching and commercializing new ways to derive high value ingredients from natural sources, right? As you can imagine, many different components of our everyday products are still sourced naturally. And that's great. Like you can think about things like, stevia or monk fruit extract, which are used as sweeteners, right? You can think of things like blueberry extract, which is used as a blue food coloring, for obvious reasons. And you can think of, many pharmaceutical and nutraceutical products, right? You can go to Whole Foods and there's a whole row of botanical extracts sitting there with various health benefits. And, one thing that people may not know is that the largest selling cancer drug of all time is actually a natural extract. It's called paclitaxel, and it's extracted from the inner bark of the yew tree. And so in the very early part of my career, I was offered a summer job working in a lab, which was making new kinds of potential anti-cancer agents, which were extracted from plants. And that was using a technology called microwave extraction. A few years later, I had the opportunity to join Maza, where we were using a patented extraction technology based on the use of high pressure and high temperature water in order to extract high value ingredients from all kinds of different sources. And then we marketed those extracts into different industries, mostly the nutraceutical industry, but also the food and flavoring, as well as the pharma industry. That company was acquired, as you said, in 2018. And that was right around the time when you saw the rise of the psychedelics industry, or at least the rise of the current iteration of the psychedelics industry. And what struck myself and the rest of the team from Maza as very peculiar was that the psychedelics industry at the time was exclusively synthetic. And that contrasted significantly to the traditional use of psychedelics by people all around the world, which was exclusively natural, right? Almost all psychedelic drugs were natural compounds that were discovered in nature by local people, and that is the way that their usage has continued to this day, right? You can imagine there's not a lot of recreational synthetic psilocybin use going on. And because the team and I had a lot of skills and expertise in how to actually make natural extracts of this kind, we decided to start Filament and dedicate our experience with natural extraction and natural products to a new company called Filament Health, where we are dedicated to extracting, sourcing, manufacturing high quality pharmaceutical grade natural psychedelic botanical extracts.
There's been a lot of interest in applying psychedelics to a range of mental health conditions, from addiction to depression. How well established is the evidence for doing so?
Well, that's a great question, and it really depends on which substance you're talking about, and it also depends on which disease you're talking about. One of the best known is MDMA for the treatment of PTSD. That compound actually has gone all the way through a couple of different phase 3 trials and has shown fairly good efficacy at treating people with PTSD. Now, unfortunately, their application to the FDA for drug marketing authorization ran into some challenges, but I think many people still believe in the preponderance of evidence for the efficacy in that case. Moving on to psilocybin, which also has shown evidence in many different indications. Again, the evidence is probably strongest so far in the area of depression and treatment-resistant depression, where you have a couple of larger phase 2 studies either completed underway and various phase 3 studies underway. And of course, typically, biotech investors generally aren't going to start spending large amounts of resources on phase 3 trials unless they have pretty compelling phase 2 data in hand, which they do. Moving on to substance use disorders, which is actually where Filament is focused, I would say that the evidence is probably a lot older in that, when psychedelics were first kind of brought into Western medicine, substance use disorders, addictions were one of the first areas where they were started to be used back in the 40s and 50s. And that continued a little bit into the 60s and 70s with some research. But now we're kind of back in earlier stage research now. So I would say that the results are kind of pilot results, early phase 2, and where Filament plans to develop is in later stage phase 2 research in stimulant use disorder, which includes both cocaine and amphetamine type stimulants, which unfortunately don't have any approved treatments going for them at the current time. So it's an area of great unmet need.
Is it understood what the mechanism of action of these substances are, or what the underlying biology is?
So these are, in general, what are known as serotonin receptor agonists, and that's the prevailing thought of how they work. They trick the brain into thinking that there's a flood of serotonin. This is what results in your hallucinogenic experience, your sort of out-of-body trip, if you will. But there is some debate around whether or not it's some kind of underlying biological mechanism which is responsible for the therapeutic effect, or is it in fact the trip itself? Is it this idea that you can have an out-of-body experience, that you can kind of independently observe what's going on in your body or in your mind, and have an opportunity to kind of come to terms with maybe past trauma or things from your past that might have an impact on your current state of health. So the jury's not totally out on why and how these drugs seem to work.
That's an interesting point, because there are many companies that are seeking to develop analogs of these compounds to deliver what they would argue is the mental health benefit without the hallucinatory effects. Is there some way of teasing those two apart and knowing if the psychedelic aspects of these drugs are going to be essential to delivering the mental health benefits?
Well, I think the answer to that question is time will tell. You're right. Many companies have touted the benefits of their non-psychedelic psychedelics, but without actual clinical results, it's tough to know whether or not those drugs will work. In our opinion at Filament, given that there is a very urgent mental health crisis going on in society, in depression and addiction and in many other areas, and the fact that we already have evidence in support of the safety and efficacy of the more classic psychedelics, we believe strongly that we need to develop the things that we already have an idea are safe and already have some kind of idea that will be effective. And we should not wait around in order to find new analogs or new forms. And also, it's a common refrain that the psychedelic trip will be something that holds back the broad adoption of psychedelic drugs. And if you think about that problem a little bit more, you can think about many treatments that happen that take many hours, right? We do open heart surgery that requires many hours and many professionals to be in the room. And that's a life-saving treatment that we do because patients require it. Dialysis, chemotherapy, you can think of many treatments that require the patient to come in and be monitored and be observed. And those aren't things that have been fatal to the adoption of those particular therapies. So it will definitely require a shift in how people are treated and how these drugs are administered, but it's not impossible. Definitely not.
Well, given that, is the expectation that people would need to be dosed in a controlled environment? And is there also a question as to delivering dosages that might be sub-hallucinatory?
Well, that's another great question. So to answer the first part, yes, I think it definitely will be a requirement for people to be dosed in a controlled, calm environment. One thing that's currently being researched is whether these drugs can be dosed in a group environment, right, where multiple patients are undergoing the therapy at once with one set of observers, facilitators present for multiple patients. So that would obviously be one strategy to reduce the operational burden. And another, as you said, would be to administer these drugs in a some kind of a microdose. And it's funny because the definition of microdose is not actually known, right? So what does that actually mean? Does it mean a dose that is not perceptible? Does it mean a dose that is not hallucinogenic? Does it mean a dose that is not impairing? What does it mean exactly? But if such a dose is able to be found effective and that people can effectively take the psychedelic drug on a daily basis or every other day or whatever the regimen may be and still go about their daily activities and still receive benefit from the treatment, well, obviously that also flips this paradigm on its head. It's not currently thought that microdosing is effective, but on the other hand, there haven't really been any adequate, well-controlled studies in diseased populations in order to study the effectiveness. Most of the studies have been kind of observational, have been on things like wellness or concentration, not things that are, disease conditions that are, easier to measure.
It strikes me that one of the benefits of using a botanical approach is that you can not only capture the active substance, but metabolites that may be important in delivering the benefit. What's known about the metabolites that are also present in psychedelics?
The answer is not much. But it's a great point in that when you take a synthetic psychedelics, such as, say, psilocybin, you have only psilocybin, right? And you lose the presence of all the secondary compounds. And just like in every other plant, you have more than just one primary metabolite. And our botanical approach obviously incorporates all of those secondary compounds. And it's very possible that over time we'll be able to demonstrate some kind of an efficacy benefit through their inclusion, either fewer side effects or faster onset time or what have you. But even a more kind of like soft benefit is you can let the recipient know, the person who's taking the drug, well, this is actually a natural product, and it comes from, at its base, it comes from a mushroom, and people might be more comfortable taking a product like that, and they might be in a better state of mind, and that can all lead to a better outcome for the patient.
What is the ability to produce a product that is consistent in terms of strength and quality through a botanical approach?
So that is the fundamental key, essentially, to our technology that we have developed at Filament. And it's taken all of our knowledge and experience in the botanical extraction industry in order to overcome the inherent variability in the psychedelic plants and fungi with which we work. So mushrooms, magic mushrooms, within the same flush of mushrooms can vary up to 5 times in terms of their psilocybin content from one mushroom to the next. So the variability is really incredible. And that matches with, what you hear about people saying about their psychedelic experiences, right? They might take mushrooms, from the same batch one day and then a month later, and they'll describe that it hits them completely different. But that totally could be possible if you have mushrooms that have plus or minus times 5 variability. But that kind of variability is definitely not acceptable for the pharmaceutical industry. And so we've developed specific technology which extracts the target compounds from the mushrooms, we purify it, and then we standardize it to a high degree of precision, which not only has a stable, repeatable product, but also one that doesn't degrade over time, and also one that can be quickly and easily absorbed by a patient that consumes it.
Filament's lead experimental candidate is in development for the treatment of methamphetamine use disorder. What is methamphetamine use disorder, and how big a problem does it represent?
So methamphetamine use disorder is the term we use to describe people who have a pattern of use of methamphetamine that is basically severely negatively impacting their lives. There are about 4.5 million people with methamphetamine use disorder in the United States, and there are currently no approved therapies for this disorder. Unlike something like opioid use disorder, where there are approved therapies, primarily substitution therapies, where you take other forms of pharmaceutical opioid agonists. Nothing like that exists for methamphetamine use disorder and cocaine use disorder, which is another type of stimulant use disorder, which we're also developing in. Rates of overdose and death are rising, and the population of users is actually getting younger and younger. So it's an area which is crying out for development, and an area in which psychedelics are showing early promise in order to be an effective treatment.
You mentioned that you're looking at other use disorders, but would you pursue these as a basket trial, or is there something different about treating methamphetamine use disorder than treating, say, cocaine use disorder?
That's a great question. We, in fact, do not plan to see a difference within the methamphetamine and the cocaine use disorder populations. However, the FDA, in order to get a broad indication label for all stimulant use disorder, the FDA wants you to demonstrate efficacy in the individual subtypes first. So we are actually pursuing both of those in a clinical study simultaneously with cocaine as well as amphetamine type stimulant use disorder.
And why start here as your first indication, given the potential broad applicability of these therapies?
So this gets back to one of the things that we were talking about earlier in the treatment infrastructure. So one of the reasons why we're interested in substance use disorders is that, as you can imagine, the existing treatment infrastructure for substance use disorders, often involves private pay 30-day residential treatment programs. And what we're proposing is essentially a one-day psychedelic therapy session instead of a 30-day residential treatment program, which can happen in facilities that already exist. So we're not talking about implementing a whole new treatment infrastructure like you would for other psychiatric indications. The other reasons why we're pursuing substance use disorders are the great unmet need, right? We're going to have 100,000 Americans die of illicit drug deaths this year. Here in Canada, in British Columbia, where the company is based, illicit drug deaths are now the leading cause of death for all citizens aged 12 to 59, right? So 13-year-olds have a higher chance of dying from drugs than they do from car crashes or accidents or anything else. So it's a really burning crisis, which at the same time, especially in the case of stimulant use disorder, has no approved therapies and not really much in the way of drug development. So plus we're seeing early signs of efficacy in this area in academic studies that have looked at treating cocaine use disorder with psilocybin. So it's a factor of all of these things. It's promising early efficacy, very large unmet need, lack of alternative therapies, and treatment infrastructure already in place.
Your lead experimental therapy is PEX-10. What is this and how does it work?
So PEX-10 is what we call our lead botanical drug. It's extracted from a specific variety of psilocybin-containing mushrooms. It's standardized in psilocybin content, highly standardized, as we were talking about earlier. But it also contains the secondary metabolites as well. And in fact, some non-active elements from the mushroom. And so this is the product that we have in FDA-approved studies, both for our own development as well as academic studies all over the world, in Europe, in Canada, in America. So that's PEX-10.
And what's known about it from studies you've done to date?
Well, we're seeing from academic studies, we're seeing early signs of efficacy in such areas as alcohol use disorder. We have some studies through our academic partners that are being set up in a whole variety of areas. People with end-of-life distress, in advanced stages of demoralization, chronic pain patients. We haven't actually completed yet any of our own in-house studies, but through our partnership network, we are starting to collect lots of really interesting data in many different indications. Another thing that we are doing that's quite unique is that we are providing our drug to a special program in Canada called the Special Access Program. And this is a program that allows patients who are in a serious or life-threatening condition to request access to our drug. And through this program, we've been fortunate enough to provide our drug to over 300 patients now suffering from either severe depression or end-of-life distress. And we do our best to collect survey data as much as we can. And these patients are reporting approximately about a 75% positive outcome rate. So it's very gratifying to see.
The phase 2 study is expected to include 90 participants. Walk me through the study. What is the dosing frequency and what will participants be asked to do?
So in this study will be a single dose study with 2 preparatory sessions and 1 integration session following the dosing session. So they'll be asked to come into the study center to do all of that. There will be a 3-month observation period during which they'll have weekly assessments, remote assessments, as well as monthly on-site assessments for the secondary outcomes. They'll also be asked to provide urine drug samples. They'll be asked to provide the researchers feedback on their drug use and on their patterns of use and on their overall health, things like that. So it'll be about a 15 week commitment on the part of the subjects.
And what are the endpoints for the study?
So we'll be looking at DSM criteria for substance use disorder in this study. And that's a little bit different than previous studies where the primary endpoint is reduction of use confirmed by urine drug test.
And what are the regulatory challenges you face, not only working with psychedelics, but with botanicals? Are there particularly regulatory hurdles you're facing?
I would say that the challenges brought by psychedelics, in that they're Schedule I controlled drugs, are greater than the challenges brought by the fact that they are botanical. In fact, the FDA has quite a well-developed what's called botanical drug guidance, and this guidance describes in pretty good detail what's required for a botanical drug. In addition, the FDA has been, I think, quite amenable to the botanical drug strategy in that they, proactively provide us with kind of like instructions on what they want to see from a manufacturing perspective. So what's challenging, however, though, is that not every jurisdiction has a botanical drug guidance like the FDA. EU and America do, but interestingly, Canada does not. So we kind of have to, for Canadian studies, change a little bit the way in which we describe the drug. In terms of working with Schedule I controlled substances, well, it's quite challenging because you need a facility that has licenses. You need to have import and export permits. Anytime you want to ship a product, it requires a whole bunch of paperwork. There's limits on how many substances you can store at any one time. It kind of list goes on and on. It is quite challenging and difficult.
And what's the business model here? Is it just to bring forward your own pipeline of therapies? Is it to leverage the extraction technology in any way, or is there a partnering component to what you're doing?
Our primary strategy is to develop our own drugs and our own pipeline and pursue these drugs through to eventual approval. That being said, we do have a number of side projects where we may manufacture psychedelic drugs for third parties or do extraction projects or things of that nature. So I would say it's both of those things.
Filament did establish a joint venture with Jaguar Health, a U.S. company that also does botanical drugs. The joint venture announced in 2023 is developing plant-derived drugs for mental health indications. What was the rationale behind this deal?
So we formed a joint venture with Jaguar Health, which, as you say, is one of the only very few companies, I would say, with an actual approved botanical drug out on the market. And we thought it would be good to partner with them because essentially they have many ideas for new botanical drugs and also regulatory experience in what it takes to get a botanical drug approved, whereas we have the actual manufacturing capability and the ability to do the earlier stage clinical development as well as the manufacturing information. So the two skill sets were quite complementary. And so we decided to form a joint venture called Magdalena Biosciences. in which we do have a number of botanical drug candidates under development, one of which is being developed for ADHD and some others which are being developed for some other neuropsychiatric indications.
Usually when you see these types of partnerships, there's not only complementary skill sets, but one of the partners usually is well-heeled and brings funding to the party. How is this venture funded? Neither of you are particularly sitting with a lot of cash these days.
So we were fortunate enough to attract the interest of external investors for this joint venture. In particular, a group called One Small Planet did actually come in and invest directly into the joint venture.
Filament is a public company with a market cap of about $6 million. Why is the company public at this stage, and do you find that it makes it easier or harder for you to access capital?
Well, that's another great question. I would say the reason we did go public back in 2021 was for access to capital. The psychedelic capital markets were open at that time, and we were able to raise $10 or $15 million over a relatively short period of time. As we've all seen, the market for biotech, small cap, psychedelics, everything since the heady days of 2020, 2021 have come back down to, something more approaching normal, I would say. And the psychedelic industry has been no different. I mean, valuations are down across the board as I think reality sets in that, good quality drug development is long and expensive, and there's no kind of magic bullets. That being said, good companies will always find a way to survive and persist and to attract the interest of high quality, sophisticated investors, which is the case with us.
How much funding has Filament been able to raise to date, and how far will existing cash take you?
We've raised about $15 million all told since the inception of the company. Our current runway, well, we haven't published our most recent quarterly financials, so I don't want to get into too many details, but I would say our current runway is fairly comfortable.
What's the plan for raising additional capital?
Well, as I said before, good companies will always attract the interest of good investors. And one of our key partners is called Negev Capital, one of the most widely known investors in the psychedelic market. So our plan is to continue doing what we've been doing, and that is telling our story to the world and getting in front of high quality, good quality investors.
Ben Lightburn, CEO of Filament Health. Ben, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. The Bio Report is a production of the Levine Media Group. To automatically download this podcast each week, subscribe to our RSS feed or through iTunes or other podcast manager. To join our mailing list, go to levinemediagroup.com. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to drop us a line or are interested in sponsoring this podcast, send an email to danny@levinemediagroup.com. Special thanks to Jonah Levine, who composed our theme music, and the Jonah Levine Collective, which performs it.